We begin with the supply side of the model by focusing on the short-run aggregate supply. The short-run aggregate supply is actually the main way the model works. But let's begin with the very basics. The way we want to model the macroeconomy is very similar to the way we traditionally use the supply and demand model with a few changes. On the horizontal axis, we're going to have aggregate output. We're going to call Q, but this is essentially gross domestic product of GDP. In the vertical axis, we're going to have the aggregate price level, which is basically the consumer price index or the GDP deflator. In this case, let's say it's a consumer price index. We're going to call that simply P, but remember that it's not the price that you have seen in the traditional supply and demand model. This is the aggregate price level in the economy. It is the average of all prices, not just one price. So the distinction in the model is really between the long term and the short term in the supply side. So in the long term, we have already said that production is determined by the inputs the economy has: labor, capital, human capital, and natural resources. This gives you the long-term aggregate supply in the model, and it's a straight line because it really doesn't depend on the aggregate price level. It really depends on the availability of inputs, which are not related to the price. This is what we're going to call long-term aggregate supply or long-term output. We can also call it potential output, as you will see in a second. In the short term, supply is very different. And to understand the relationship between supply in the long term and the short run, and the way the price level adjusts them, it's better to start with a simple example question. Suppose last year a firm expected inflation this year to be 10%, and then based on this expectation, it signed a contract with its workers agreeing to pay them $20 an hour. Yet, the actual inflation turns out to be only 30%. In other words, the firm underestimated inflation when it negotiated the contract with the employer. So the question is, as a result of this misestimation during the year the contract is in place, let's say this year, the firm will what? Will reduce the quantity of output supply, will increase the quantity of output supply, or will keep the quantity supply the same?